Christina. I'm a first year medical student at UCLA. So we're med mentors, and all of us here are at DGSOM, and we're here to answer any questions that you have applying to medical school. So if you have any other questions, you can also find us on our Instagram page, which is UCLA Med Mentors, or our Facebook page. So getting started, I just want to introduce all of the panelists that we have today. So these are all my classmates, and we're all first year medical students finishing up our first year next week. So Andrew, do you want to start?
Yeah. Hey guys, my name is Andrew Lee. I'm a first year DGSOM, like my classmates here. I went to Stanford for undergrad. Yeah, and I'm happy to answer any questions related to challenges you're facing in school with trying to be a competitive pre-med applicant. If you're like more non-traditional like me, who decided to be pre-med a little later. Yeah, happy to help.
And then Adolfo.
Hey guys, so I am also a first year med student, and I went to UCSB for my undergrad, and I also consider myself a non-traditional applicant, so I feel like I can answer a few questions you guys might have when it comes to that. And yeah.
Great. And Anna?
Hey, you may have seen me at some previous Med Mentor Mondays, but they're a lot of fun, so I'm back. I went to UC Berkeley for undergrad, so go Bears. And I also decided kind of late in my undergrad journey that I wanted to go to med school, so I'm very familiar with having like not the perfect application or not doing everything you feel like you're supposed to do. So excited to talk more about that today.
And then Brandon.
Hey, good to see everyone again. I'm Brandon, also a first year medical student, also in the MD PhD program. I graduated from UCLA in 2017. Yeah.
Cool. Michelle.
Hey everyone, I'm Michelle. I also graduated from UCLA in 2017 with Brandon. Yeah, and looking forward to answer any questions you guys might have.
Great. And then, so these are our main panelists that will be speaking on the questions that we'll be asking them. And then we'll also have a couple people monitoring the Q&A. So we have Michelle. If you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm also a first year medical student. I went to UCLA as well, graduated in 2018, the Bruins. And I'll be monitoring the Q&A chat today along with Eric, and we'll be responding to any questions that are posted there. And I might be chiming in as well throughout the session if I have anything to add.
And then we also have Eric that's going to be monitoring the Q&A.
Hi everyone, I also went to Stanford like Andrew. You may recognize me from 2 weeks ago, but yeah, I'm happy to help with anything, especially your questions. And so don't hesitate to ask any.
And then I'm not sure if Ryan is answering questions, but yeah.
I can. What's up, guys? I'm just sort of here in the background if anything goes wrong or you guys have any questions focused for me.
Okay, great. So I guess with that, if anyone has anything else to add, I'll just kind of get started on the first question. So first question is, what challenges did you encounter before submitting your medical school application, and how did you overcome it? So this can be things like low GPA, low MCAT score, not getting enough internships, finding research, or like knowing whether you're doing enough. So anyone can chime in.
I can go first. So I feel like as a pre-med, especially when it comes to universities where there's a very large pre-med population, and it could be very stressful to be in that environment. You're kind of pushed or peer pressured into applying when you don't think you're personally ready. And for example, I feel like I didn't have a high enough MCAT score or a GPA, but I applied, and unfortunately I didn't get in my first time. But second time around, I got in. But I just feel like sometimes it can be difficult to um, view yourself as mentally ready for this process, because it's a difficult process. So I feel like you have to kind of like understand that you gotta understand that your application is ready and that you're giving it its most at the moment.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think like another aspect of that, comparing yourself to others, is like wondering if you're doing enough. I know so many students like wonder about that. And there's kind of a tendency to see what other people are doing and think, oh, I have to do the same thing. Or, if everyone else is in like a pre-med club, I should be in a pre-med club. And so I want to emphasize like, do what you're passionate about. And I think the most successful like med school applications are from people who are like passionate about things, I don't know, and show a demonstrated, interest in that. And they don't try to just like check the boxes of everything they think they need. So I think that's like something I've seen a lot of in my classmates, is just like people who have like these awesome, varied, diverse interests and are passionate about different things. And so I think just emphasizing like, do what you want to do and what you're driven towards, and not doing what you think you should be doing or what everyone else is doing.
Yeah, kind of speaking to both Anna and Adolfo's points, right? There's this kind of peer pressure where you feel like you have to check off all the boxes. You have to get your clinical volunteering, you have to do your research, you have to like publish a paper, you have to join whatever clubs. But I mean, to be honest, that's really what you want to do, is just do something that you're really passionate about, and that's going to come through in your application. And I think I would say that a lot of my classmates here at DGSOM, have such diverse interests and backgrounds, and not everyone kind of follows that cookie cutter checklist. You should really pursue what you're passionate about, and that's going to come through in your application.
Yeah, and to add on to that, just a lot of us here and even in our class at DGSOM did take gap years. So I think it's important to remember that it's not like stigmatized or anything to take extra time. A lot of the time you can't do everything you want to do in undergrad because you have so much other stuff going on. So taking another year or two to really engage in those activities that you're interested can really help benefit both your mental health and your application in the long run.
Yep, so several of us are actually UCLA undergrad alumni, and we know how difficult it can be to be a pre-med at UCLA. I know there are like a bajillion clubs or like pre-med organizations that are out there that are weirdly competitive for whatever reason. Just know that when I was a freshman, I got rejected from every single organization that I applied to. I kid you not. And it really didn't make a difference in the end, because here I am at UCLA Medical School. But just know that like there's this culture at UCLA that, is really pressuring for you to do all these things that your peers are doing. And that's not necessarily like what you also need to be doing as well. I really want to echo what Anna said about following your passions, because that's really what will allow your application to shine.
I really had the same experience as Brandon in freshman year and even sophomore year, with being rejected from all these pre-med clubs. And I remember it was really disheartening at first, and I had to learn to get through dealing with rejection. But I realized that there's actually so many different opportunities in LA itself that you can explore. And I think we're so lucky to be in LA because there's so many free clinics, there's so many organizations. So don't be afraid to explore the greater LA area and see what opportunities are out there for you. And like that really worked out for me personally. And I was able to find my place on campus, but also being involved in all like other organizations that aren't affiliated with UCLA.
Great. So I'm going to move to the next question. The first one more focused on challenges before the application cycle. So this one is more during. What challenges did you come across during the application process, and how did you overcome it? So these are things like constructing a compelling narrative with your interests outside of medicine, things like obtaining letters of recs from professors who weren't responding, or late submissions, things like that.
Cool.
one of-
Oh, sorry, you go first.
Go ahead, Andrew.
So for me personally, I applied to a ton of schools, and I think once the secondary started rolling in, it got, so I think it definitely helps to you try to do your secondaries as quickly as possible, maybe pre-write. I got personally when I was applying.
Okay, I can chime in next. I know I mentioned earlier, like I was one of the students who kind of decided later in my undergrad years that I wanted to go to med school. So I know like a lot of my concern before I applied and while I was applying was like, oh, a lot of my activities aren't really like related to medicine. And I had a lot of activities kind of outside of the medical field. I was really into like animal behavior, and like I did research on spiders. It had like literally nothing to do with medicine at all. So I was really worried about how to like apply that to a medical school application. And I think you should know that there are like many like transferable like soft skills for things like research. Like no matter what field you're doing research in, like you're learning really important things. And same goes for like a club or or not clinical volunteering. I'm talking about like non-medical stuff, but like other volunteering, it can still display skills and like qualities about yourself that are important in medicine without being directly related to medicine. I hope that's kind of making sense. But like if you are, you know, creating your own research project and you had to be like creative and flexible, those things are all transferable skills to medicine. So even if it doesn't seem directly related, you can still talk about those experiences and they can still play a large role in your application. You can write about them in your personal statement. You can write about them in secondaries, even if it's not like all medical school. So, yeah.
Absolutely. So I was a dancer in undergrad, and I wrote about dancing in my essays. And obviously dancing, well, not obviously, but like I didn't have anything to say related to medicine about dancing. It's just something that I like talked about in my essays. Another thing that I wanted to mention was that when I was filling out my application, I knew kind of what my strengths and weaknesses were. For example, I knew that my MCAT and my GPA were going to be one of my weaknesses because my numbers aren't that great, whereas some of my activities would be some of my strengths that made me stand out. So when I was strategizing how I would want to frame my application, I kind of took the approach of not really addressing the challenges that I had and really just focusing on my strengths. So for example, since all of you are UCLA students, you might be familiar with LS4, which is the genetics class, or Math 3C, which is the probabilities class. I had actually failed LS4, and I got like either a C- or a C in Math 3C. So those were like probably the two worst classes that I had. So I had to retake LS4, but nowhere in my application did I mention or bring attention to these weaknesses or shortcomings, because I would rather have the reader of my application focus on some of the things that really highlight me. So don't feel like you need to justify some of the challenges that you face. Of course, there are essays that you will write about overcoming adversity, and those would be perfect opportunities for you to mention any of the challenges that you faced and what you learned from addressing those. But don't feel like you have to explain every single mistake that you made along the way, because there's this notion that you have to be a perfect applicant, and that's really not true.
I totally agree with that. And just like throwing in one extra point in there is that some schools in secondaries, I remember one specifically asked you to explain any grade lower than a B. And I also had many grades lower than a B, including B minus. That was University of South Florida, in case anyone's wondering. But I still got an interview there. And I think something important about talking about like lower grades is that, wait, Christine, are you talking? No, never mind, sorry. About explaining lower grades is that you have to kind of take responsibility for them and like make sure you're trying to not like place blame on other factors. Like it's okay if there were other factors that were influential. It's definitely good to talk about those, but like be careful about walking the line between like, oh, it wasn't my fault, these things happened to me, and like, oh, you know, it was really difficult because X, Y, and Z, but, you know, I was still able to overcome that later and like get better grades later in other classes. So just like talking about your redemption and how you overcame that, I think is really important. And that, yeah, you can handle kind of the academic rigor now because you've learned from your mistakes or something like that.
Even though I'm like just asking questions, I do want to like point something out too, is that like I applied to a lot of schools, like a lot. And like Andrew said, it's a little overwhelming. So what I found was super helpful was like a lot of schools don't change their essays from year to year. So you can like look up their secondaries and you can see if they've changed within like the past few years. And if they haven't, then most likely they're not going to. So I like pre-wrote some essays and I found that that was making things a lot more manageable when I applied to medical school. And it definitely like helps with your mental health, just like having a way to structure, you know, the application cycle so you don't feel too overwhelmed. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. I took 2 gap years, so I wrote my secondaries during my gap year, but I pre-wrote all of my secondaries based on the essays on SDN. Otherwise, I do not recommend going on SDN. But yeah, like Adolfo, I actually applied twice, and I think this is more relevant for UC students where the quarter system doesn't end until after you're like generally supposed to submit your primary essay. And so the first time I applied, I didn't really think about how much time I would give to the application, and I kind of just like rushed through it because of all my other commitments. And so I really like did not put much effort into my first application because of school. So that's also an important consideration to make sure you can handle all your current commitments and finals and graduation and everything while working on your primary and starting your secondary essays.
I completely agree with that. I feel like, just as Michelle said, like try to take priority of the things you have in control at the moment and finish those first. And once you feel like you're ready to apply, like then that's your main priority. Otherwise, I feel like if you do things out of order or without a structure, you kind of like fall behind. And I feel like looking back at things, and if I would have realized that I wasn't ready my first time, I would have, done things differently and got it in my first time. But everything happens for a reason, and yeah, we learn from our mistakes. But yeah, just be sure you're ready when you apply.
Yeah, to kind of add to that point, it's also important to make sure you take breaks for yourself when you're applying because it's a pretty long cycle. You don't want to burn yourself out writing like this about the same 3 or 4 prompts over and over again. So just make sure you schedule in some time for yourself. And with secondaries that have similar questions, pro tip, go back and make sure you're using the right institution's name and not, just copying and pasting over the same essay a couple times without changing the school name. I did that once or twice, but I caught myself. So.
Okay.
Some of the other challenges that I faced was that one of my letter of rec writers actually decided not to write a letter of rec anymore, which was a little concerning, but basically it was one of my research mentors that I did a summer project with. And then they ended up deciding not to write the letter of rec when they had said previously that they would. And the way that I approached this was that it's kind of like dodging a bullet, right? Like, had this person written a letter of rec, it probably wouldn't have been like a stellar letter of rec anyway. So in the end, it probably benefited me that this person didn't write a letter of rec, because in my opinion, a mediocre letter of rec is worse than no letter of rec at all.
Yeah, speaking about letters of rec, just make sure you find someone who really knows you to write your letter, because I think people who are reading the applications kind of know a generic letter from someone who really knows you and knows your pros, your strengths and weaknesses, and can really vouch for you in the letter. So just kind of think of a mentor, professor that you've worked with, you know, very well, who can write you a strong letter recommendation. Because like Brandon said, a mediocre letter of rec is sometimes, you know, does more harm than good.
And it's totally okay to arrange a meeting with your letter writer and sit down with them and kind of tell them what you want them to emphasize in that particular letter. Because you may have multiple letter writers that, you know, kind of want to talk about the same amazing qualities that you have. And it doesn't do you any good to have multiple letters talking about the same thing. So you can actually sit down with your letter writers and say, hey, I actually want you to really emphasize this quality about me because I have other letter writers already talking about these other things.
I also found it a little hard, like finding a letter writer, like who would know me best, especially because I came from a big university too. Like I went to Michigan. And so, especially in like these big pre-med classes, like how are they gonna know who I am? So I guess like a little advice I can give is like in the beginning of the semester, just go to like their office hours and like get to know them. And if you feel like you can connect with them and they're super approachable, then like keep going with it and like try to make an effort to like get to know them, even if like you don't have anything to ask. Like I think sometimes it's just good to show up and like show how dedicated you are to the class and like your curiosity, and then from there you can really, you know, build a good relationship and make yourself known. And if you like go to the office hours and you realize like, oh, like I'm not really sure I click with this person, at least you know that from the beginning of the class and you don't have to go further.
I also found that it was a bit easier to get to know the professor better in my upper division classes where class sizes were a lot smaller. And personally, I asked for my letter recs in senior year. And by that time, I had kind of a rough draft of what I was going to write in my personal statement. And when I was asking my letter writers, I came in with like a description of my activities and describing like why they were meaningful to me and potentially like qualities I wanted them to highlight in my letter. And I found that it was helpful for them as well. Just if they didn't have as much of a chance to get to know me in office hours, they at least had like the descriptions to refer to get to know me better.
Yeah, I agree with that. During my second application, I I knew who I wanted my letter writers to be, but I kind of like had my personal statement written at the moment already, so I kind of like gave them a draft of that so they could read it over and understand my, you know, the reasons why I was applying to medical school and my thoughts and whatnot. So that definitely helped with them, you know, writing a much stronger letter. And to kind of add to other points that were mentioned earlier, just because you received, you know, I mean, I feel like, you know, getting a letter of rec from professors that, you know, you've done well in their classes, you know, I mean, that's great. But personally, I feel like if that's all they can say about you, like, oh, you know, the student got, you know, A's in all the 3 classes that they took with me, I don't think that's strong enough. I personally feel like maybe taking or getting professors to write your letter of rec in which you got a C and then you got a B and then you got an A in their classes shows a much stronger dedication to their class, and it shows the resilience that you have in continuing to put the effort and the work for this, you know, material. And it kind of shows how even though you are gonna fail at times, it's gonna you're gonna overcome it and succeed.
Yeah, I think also just another note about like the types of letters you get. I think if there's capacity and if you have someone good to ask, think about getting like what I would call like a character letter. Like I worked at a summer camp and I had one of the directors from the summer camp write me a letter. And of course you can say anything about me academically, but could really speak to like my character and my personality more. And I think those can be really beneficial in like presenting a different side, because most schools will ask for like these academic letters and sometimes it only shows you in this academic light. So about like how you do in classes or how you did in research. And while those are really important, I think sometimes it can kind of add another dimension to you if you're able to show who you are outside of academics as well. So that's another point to consider.
Yeah, to kind of add to that, because I think there are a couple questions coming up in Q&A about how many letters you should get, what type of letters, and I think Anna answered that pretty well with the, you know, character letter is important. I think I had 4 letters of rec total. 2 were like academic. 1 was a character one from a summer camp I also did, and I had another one from my boss. So I think, yeah, it's good to get someone who knows you kind of personally and knows your character strengths, character flaws, someone who could vouch for your like professionalism and your work ethic, and 2 more academically focused ones.
I think also to note is like some schools have requirements for letters of rec. So you can get like 5 or 6 letters of recs from like your professor's work, volunteering and stuff, but you don't have to send them all to each school, because some schools will only want like, some schools will be very specific and say, we want 2 science and like 1 non-science, or we want, you know, you can only send 4 letters max. So you can have like a set of letters to use at how you want, and you can kind of strategize on where you want to send those letters as well. So does anyone?
Yeah, I definitely echo that. So my approach was to collect letters as I went instead of like asking for all of them like towards the application cycle. And then so, you know, obviously like as my 4 years of undergrad went by, I collected, you know, several letters, but then as I got to know more and more professors and ask them for letters, I realized that like some letters and some of my relationships with some professors would be better than others. So it's like a constantly evolving process, and you can really kind of figure out like who's gonna write a better letter, I guess, and then pick and choose which letters you want to send over to the medical schools. What I will say is that I did make the mistake, I guess, of I think there's a requirement that you have to have a letter from like a humanities professor or something like that. I actually didn't have one because I like the only humanities classes I took were in, like my GEs, and I didn't really like put in much effort into those, unfortunately. So I ended up applying without a humanities letter. I mean, one of many things that were like weird about my application, but I think I was able to get away with it because I was an MD PhD applicant. So I have a feeling they like emphasize humanities a little bit less, but again, I'm not really too sure. More of the story is just to consider the requirements of medical schools and keep those in mind as you take your humanities classes. Don't neglect them.
I think it's a good rule of thumb to have at least 5 letters of rec, like 2 from science professors, 1 from a humanities professor, because a lot of schools will require you to like have at least 3, and other schools will have a maximum of 5. So I think that's like a good number, and have a variety in the letters that you do have.
Okay, if no one has anything else to add, we can go to our next question.
Christina, I'm actually, if I
Oh yeah,
may add
go
in a
ahead.
point about the letters of rec, I saw a question in the Q&A about professors backing out or not being able to have the time for it. As a medical or as a pre-medical student, your sort of job should really be to try to make the process as easy as possible for your rec letter writers. So providing them with information about what you would want to see included in your rec letter would be really good. And in my case, I actually had to draft several of my own rec letters and then provide those to professors as a way of like, okay, this is what I personally would sort of like to see in it. And then if you provide them that framework, some of them might be able to use that as sort of a guide or otherwise to write your letter. So on the record, I would say don't be afraid to even send like a draft of what you would want, especially if someone has some resilient, or not resilience, but some concerns about having to spend the time on it. So.
Yeah, some people actually ask you to draft one for them too, because if you like ask a attending physician, they might be so busy. So don't be surprised if they ask you that. Okay. So the next question is gonna just go along with the application cycle. So this one is, what challenges did you come across after the application process and how did you overcome it? So these are things like overcoming bad interviews, not getting many interviews, reapplying to medical school, ways to cope with rejection, and mental health while waiting to hear back, and just addressing imperfect parts of your application.
I'll start with this one. So as I mentioned, one of my weaknesses was probably my GPA. And I want to start with saying that your first interview will always be your hardest interview because you really don't know what to expect. But everything after that becomes a lot easier. And you're much more relaxed. So at my first interview, one of my interviewers had asked me why my GPA was so low. And honestly, at that time, I was so shocked by that question. That was like the very first question after like, oh, like introduce yourself. Then they asked me like, why is your GPA so low? And I was so shocked. I had no idea how to respond. This was like, I was not expecting that at all. So I ended up not getting an offer to that school. But I think after that experience, after like, you know, having a bad interview, like again, your first one is going to be the hardest. You really learn how to like, you know, answer questions on the spot, deal with challenging questions. So don't worry if like not all of your interviews go well. Like some of them will go well, some of them won't, and you just have to learn from like the mistakes that you make during the interviews that don't go well.
Going along those lines, when it comes to having interviews, your first few interviews are going to be difficult, not just because you're nervous and because you don't know what to expect, but just because you haven't heard these types of questions before, and you're not really sure the type of answer they're looking for. So as you progress, you're going to realize that even though these interview questions are different for each school, although some might be, you know, repetitive at times, they all try to gauge the same sort of values and like concerns and, you know, ethical thoughts that you guys might have. I mean, that they're trying to like find in an applicant. So as you do more of these interviews and more of these questions, it's like it just gets easier knowing how to respond to these answers and what they're looking for.
I think like in general, a good idea for going into interviews, I think we'll probably do another Med Mentor Mondays, like when it gets closer to interviews, just about interviews, but just some like broad advice. There are some questions that come up over and over and over again, like, tell me about yourself, or like, why do you want to go into medicine? And so just having like a general framework for those questions can help you feel more prepared, and maybe help the interview go a little bit more smoothly. And then like, if you're worried about getting the hard hitting questions like Brandon, and I also got the same question about like lower grades my freshman year. So, you know, I took it in stride. But yeah, you can kind of be prepared for those questions to come, but also try not to sound scripted. So you want to have a general idea of what you're going to say, but not like exactly written out. So you're not just like reading from your memory. But yeah.
Yeah, and I just want to point out a lot of my friends who thought they had like bad interviews or something still ended up getting into that school. So what you perceive as a bad interview may not actually affect your application, or it might have been good, but you just have very high standards for yourself. To answer one of the questions that just came in, I know for my UCLA interview, our like entire group had like a good cop, bad cop situation. And so coming out of the like harder interview, you're obviously going to feel a little dejected, but you have to like keep going through the whole interview day. So I would just try to keep it out of your minds. If you get a room to relax, just like take time and relax. Don't think about like what you could have done differently, because you're just going to spiral, and then you're just going to get more stressed for the rest of the interviews.
Yeah, I would say at the end of the day, just try to have a conversation with whoever's interviewing you, right? Instead of trying to relay scripted answers, because because at the end of the day, the interviewer is just trying to get to know you as a person and as a future physician. So it really helps just kind of, take a deep breath, relax, and just talk to them about things you're interested in, your passions, and why you want to go into medicine.
I also think that this whole process is like very anxiety filling. So I think the number one thing is just to stay off SDN, please, because I was on SDN a lot, just like tracking when schools release secondaries, when schools release their first wave of, interviews and acceptances, and then you start comparing yourself to other people. And I think that what everyone needs to remember is people are only going on there to post when they have good news, or like they're only going on there to post their high stats. So you're only going to hear about the people that score over like 520s and have all these like acceptances, and they have in their like signature like how many schools they've applied to and how many acceptances. And I think that that is not an accurate representation of people applying to medical school, and that is also not an accurate representation of the people that you will be attending medical school with. So just staying off of that, I think, really will help you in the long run, just because it is such a long process applying to medical school and waiting to hear back. So I think that is really going to help mental health.
I'll raise a point about the interviews just from the background here. Also keep in mind that some of your interviews are just going to be out of your control. Your interviewer might be having a really, really bad day. They might have gotten news. They might have lost a patient earlier or something like that. So sometimes there are elements that you can't control. And sometimes they're just plain mean. I had an interview in a prominent school in the Northeast, and I literally had this person tell me straight to my face that he did not think I should pursue an MD PhD and would recommend against that to the committee. And that was like probably one of the lowest moments of my entire application process. But I think like it also reflects sort of the ideals of the school. Like if you are running into problems with interviewers and they're having issues with you or your application or who you are as a person, then that might be reflective of perhaps, like some people have said, for other elements that you're dodging a bullet. And I can now say, attending UCLA with all these wonderful people you see in the panel here, that I have no regrets.
Does anyone have anything else they want to add before we move on to the next question? And this is just like overcoming bad interviews, not getting enough interviews, reapplying, if anyone wants to talk about that, coping with rejections. I know all of us have gotten rejected by school, and it doesn't feel good.
I can talk a bit about reapplying. So after my first interview cycle, after my first application cycle in which I didn't get accepted to any school, that was a very, very low point for my life, because I was like, wow, I've been, going to school ever since, middle school and college and whatnot, and thinking I was gonna be a doctor, and like putting all my work and effort and everything I had towards, this goal of mine. And then at the end of the day being told that I wasn't going to become a doctor. That was a very hard hit for me. And it took me, I want to say it took me a good like month or two to kind of like overcome that news because I just didn't know how to cope with it. But I knew that deep down inside of me, I really wanted to become a physician for my own personal reasons. So I, got back up and I didn't reapply directly right after. Like I didn't like directly apply the following year because I knew that wasn't going to work at all. So I made sure to do things that will strengthen my application, whether it was to retake the MCAT and study for it differently, or take CC courses to help with my GPA, to do more extracurricular activities that I know that I would benefit from, to get stronger letters of rec. I kind of like came up with a plan on what I was gonna do next, rather than kind of like doing my mistake over again. Because I feel like I know a few people who were in my shoes, and right after they applied and didn't get in, they they pretty much applied with the same the same application, and they didn't get in again. And I feel like it's important to kind of like take a step back, realize where realize your mistakes, and understand that something went wrong somewhere along the path, and you're gonna go back and fix that and plan from there on.
Also, like a note about that, if you're not sure kind of where you went wrong, get opinions on your application. And like some schools that you apply to, like you can just email all of them and most of them won't give you feedback, but a couple will. And it'll help you kind of to discern like what exactly went wrong. Cause it's really easy to spot like a lower MCAT or GPA, but it's kind of harder if you're not sure like where in your extracurriculars, or like maybe you had a rec letter that wasn't great and that kind of tanked your application. So you can get feedback from other people, from schools, and also from like the pre-health career center staff, even us, maybe, yeah. But yeah, just kind of like really taking the time to figure out what exactly went wrong can be really beneficial in reapplying.
I think that like also touches on like not only reapplying, but during the application process. You can ask a lot of different people, but you don't have to take everyone's advice. Um, everyone will have something to give you. And then from there, you can kind of pick and choose on what advice you want to take. Because at the end of the day, this is how you want to portray yourself, and you know yourself best. And in addition to that, with getting advice, I also found that like, so I did a post-bac at the NIH just to do research for a year, and I went to one of the advisors and they read through my personal statement and they said, look, these activities are really good, but I think you haven't really touched on leadership, and I know that you have leadership. So from there, I knew how to like reword my application to let that quality shine. So just really taking advantage of the different resources that the school or the program that you're in has to offer. I could have taken that and said, well, I actually think, I talked about leadership well enough, but like having that option and like that point of view was really helpful. And from there, I decided where to go from that.
I just want to say that like whether it's retaking the MCAT or having to do a post-bac or reapplying to medical school, there's no shame at all in doing something over again to improve your application. There's like no shame at all. Like no one will ever know unless you bring it up. And then like all your classmates will just view you the same as they view all the other classmates, right? Like it doesn't really negatively impact you at all. So like try to like fight all the stigma against like gap years or like reapplications or retaking MCAT, because that's all like BS in my opinion.
Yeah, just to talk a little bit about reapplying. In my case, it was definitely like a very hard blow, like Adolfo said. I think in undergrad, if you like, I checked off all the boxes of what I needed to do as a pre-med to get into medical school, but that doesn't necessarily always transfer over on the application. So taking the time to really like tell your story on the application, and thinking about exactly what aspects of your life are valuable to you, and like what you want to get across to the admissions committee is does take a lot of time and a lot of effort into your writing. And in reflection, the school list is also very important. So it seems like a very basic step, but like taking the time to go through MSAR or whatever, to like go through each school and like see how many out of state, in state applicants they take, what kind of values they have as a school, and whether or not you feel like you would be a good match there, is like setting the foundation for a good application.
I think going on like what you said, like being a well-rounded applicant, I think a good question in the chat was, do you have any tips for being a well-rounded applicant? So this is to all the panelists, but also on your point on what you said about like looking on MSAR, I don't want anyone to feel like you shouldn't apply somewhere just because they take a lot of in-state, just because I'm from Maryland and UCLA is majority Californian people, just because everyone in California is going to apply to all the California schools. So I think naturally it pans out that the school will mostly be California. So you don't really know your opportunities until you just put yourself out there and apply. So don't sell yourself short. If you have any interest, apply and then see where it takes you from there, because the opportunity is not going to be there if you don't apply.
Yeah, so my situation might be a little bit different because again, I'm an MD PhD student, but when I was applying, I did not look at GPA and MCAT at all. One, because my numbers were low, but two, I didn't really want to base my like selection of schools based on numbers alone, right? Like I really wanted to look at fit and whether or not I would enjoy and be happy going to that school. So to give you an idea, UCLA obviously was my first choice, but my second choice, and it's like a top 20 medical school, but my second choice was actually like ranked like 80 or something. And like you might think, oh, like why would that be your second choice when like UCLA is so much better in ranking? Again, like numbers in the end didn't really matter to me. So you don't have to let the numbers like guide your school list. You can if that's like kind of the approach you want. Again, everyone takes a different approach. I'm not saying one way is better than the other, but that's the approach I took.
Just to add on to that, I know things are going to be a little bit different for you guys in terms of how you choose schools, because STEP is going to become pass fail. So people are saying that the ranking of the school suddenly matter a lot more. Again, there's no firm evidence that that's true. So in the end, you just want to choose a school that you feel like it's going to be a good fit for you. And then there's always going to be other factors contributing into like residencies and stuff. So just because like Harvard is ranked #1, it doesn't mean that like not going to Harvard is going to affect your future in any way.
Okay. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, also keep in mind that during the interview process, even though we all sort of go into that having an idea that, oh, this is the school selecting me based on if I'm good enough, you are also selecting the school based on your perception of what you're experiencing during that time. So if during even the interview, like usually people think, oh, you know, it's the second look where I get to sort of be the one taking the reins and making choices. No, the interview is a way for you to get an idea as well. And you can get a sense of your potential classmates, your potential instructors, your potential deans. And that's really an opportunity to go about that. So I would not recommend taking sort of a passive role in the interview process.
Okay, so if anyone else has anything else, if anyone else doesn't have anything to say, I'll move on to the next question, but we can always go back if you think of something, just to move it forward. since we have like 10 minutes left. Last question, what advice do you have for overcoming obstacles and staying resilient? How do you regain your motivation when something doesn't go the way you planned?
I think in terms of like reapplying or even just like staying motivated throughout the cycle, because in my opinion, the worst part of the cycle is like waiting for months to hear back from schools because they're not going to respond very quickly. Like, remember why you're applying to medical school. Obviously, like, no one's applying to medical school for a frivolous reason, and you want to make a difference, or like you're passionate about medicine or something. Reminding yourself of why you're going through this tedious process, but also like making time to like talk to your family, hang out with your friends, because right before like you start school is going to be the most freedom you have for many years. And so taking the time to really enjoy your like last moments of freedom before starting medical school, just to like stay happy and keep your mind off of all the anxiety from the applications, is always helpful.
During the application process, there's a lot of self-reflection. And with self-reflection comes a lot of self-doubt sometimes. And with that self-doubt, I think it's important to know that like no one is perfect. Everyone faces obstacles and challenges. And I think the way that you overcome those obstacles and challenges are what shows that you can grow. And so the panelists that are here today all are far from perfect, and that's why we want to share our experiences with you today. So just know that you don't have to be perfect. It's okay to doubt yourself sometimes, but know that you are a badass applicant and you're going to do great.
Preach, Brandon.
And I feel like at this point we can, since we just have like 5-6 minutes left, we can open up the Q&A to, if anyone has any follow-up questions from the course of the discussion, any related questions we can touch on again, or if any of you guys have like any burning points that you want to touch on as well.
I think just reiterating what Brandon already said, like, it's okay to not be perfect, and like you don't have to do what everyone else is doing. You don't have to like follow the exact same path that everyone else is following. Like, everyone's path to medical school looks so different. So if you feel like you made all these big mistakes, like, and you're, you know, it's so different from what everyone else is doing, like, don't worry about it. Do the best thing for you. Worry about yourself, and like really work on your own application and like your own passions. And yeah, like, I think there's just so much of like comparing yourself to others in the application process, and it can be like so detrimental, because like you won't look like anyone else because you want your application to be unique. Like, that's a positive thing. So yeah, definitely not being afraid to be a little bit different, and yeah, just capitalizing on what you're passionate about will like serve you very well in the end.
Just going on like the comparing thing, I even think that touches when you get to medical school. Like, I think a big thing for me at least is comparing myself to my classmates and like seeing what they're doing, but just really remembering like at the end of the day, this is your story and how you want to play it out. So I think that reflects back onto your journey going into medical school. If you take 1 year off and your friends don't, or if you take 2 years off and your friends don't, at the end of the day, it's your path into medical school. And when I got to UCLA, I met people that, you know, worked a whole career before they came to our school, or they took like 2 years and went around like the world and did really cool things. And because I was just in my bubble at school, like I didn't know people were doing these things and having these different paths. I was just comparing myself to my friends. And I think you just really need to remember that, you know, this field is filled with people from all different walks of life, and this is your path, and you just take it at your own pace. Because if you get into medical school this year or next year, it's not going to really make a difference at the end of the day.
Yeah, just to echo what they've been saying regarding like being a well-rounded applicant, I personally don't believe that exists. Each applicant has their own like uniqueness and something they're passionate about. So what I think everyone in our class has at UCLA is something that they are passionate about. And the diversity essay in the secondary might just seem like another thing you have to do, but in the end, the diversity of our class really helps bring something new to each discussion, whether it be the social aspect or the medical aspect of each patient case. So whatever experiences you have will influence the way you view your patients and your classmates in the future. And so I feel like any experience in that regard can be valuable.
A note onto some of the things that people have said before. Also, keep in mind that pre-meds are notoriously good at like maintaining a facade that everything is going well and peachy and that there aren't any issues that they're encountering. So just because you're not hearing about someone else suffering through an essay or having to rewrite their personal statement or having maybe an MCAT or a GPA that they didn't like doesn't mean that that's not happening. So again, really try not to compare yourself because you are individual, you are different, and you are entirely capable based on your
All right. We have a couple minutes left. Does anyone have anything else to add or any questions if you scroll through the Q&As that you want to address? I mean, someone asked on the Q&A about like public schools outside of California. Just because I came from Maryland where there's only one public school rather than like California where there's a ton, I think you should just apply to schools that you're interested in. That's like what everyone said. There's like a couple exceptions that schools only take in-staters, but kind of like on the point I said before, if you're interested in the school, just apply. Because I almost didn't apply to UCLA. This was my last school, and my dad begged me to apply, and I said, they're not going to take me. Like, I'm out of state. There's no point. But you really don't know until you apply, and just give yourself the opportunity. So just make sure you see if the school like even takes out-of-staters. Because I know, like, for example, if you were out of state and applied to Loma Linda, they don't even take, or like, yeah, they don't take out of state. So just make sure you look at that. But if there's like a low percentage of out of state, they still take out of staters. So give yourself that opportunity.
Yeah, and if you've been in California your whole life, it is incredibly important for you guys to also apply out of state, because all the California medical schools, while they do prefer in-state, it's like a 60% or something. So it's not guaranteed as like if you applied in Texas, a lot of the Texas schools only take Texas residents. So you do want to go apply to certain out-of-state schools, but also check that it's not like 95% in-state. But if it's like Christina's point, if it's like even like 70 or 80%, I would go for it if you really care about that school.
I'm just gonna add a quick plug to fill out the feedback form before you guys head out. It really helps us like shape future sessions and like decide what topics to present on and like how to structure our session. So give us some feedback, let us know how we're doing, and we will incorporate that. But thank you, for listening. It's in the chat. Thank you, Stacey.
All right, I think our time is up. It's 1:00 now. If anyone else has any other questions, feel free to message us on like the Facebook page or our Instagram. We monitor that pretty closely, so we can answer that for you. And we also have like more sessions coming up in the summer. We don't have one next week because we have an exam, but just stay tuned. We'll be back. Yeah. Does anyone have anything else to say before we close this out?
Yeah, stay safe, everyone.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Bye.